Hi students, in this video I'm going to be introducing the topic of the Cold War, fascinating period of history during the second half of the 20th century, and this ideological conflict that emerges after World War II. That's led by the Soviet Union on one side and the United States of America on the other side. And in the end, it boils down to an ideological conflict between communism, Marxist communism. The model has been implemented in the Soviet Union and is now being spread to other countries throughout the world, and the liberal democracy that's been promoted by the United States and is being promoted in other countries around the world. And we see this begin with Soviet control of Eastern Europe, that at the Yalta Conference towards the end of World War II, the Soviets, the Russians led by Stalin, had promised that they would give all the Eastern European countries free elections once they had defeated the Germans. And that just doesn't happen. They come in, they take military control, and they militarily occupy these countries, and they impose a system of a communist government on them. That there's only one political party that's permitted, the Communist Party, that any kind of resistance to this agenda, culturally, intellectually, politically, is brutally suppressed. And this is seen, Winston Churchill uses this phrase of an iron curtain coming down on Europe. The occupation, that refers to the occupation of Eastern Europe by the Soviet communists after World War II. And this calls for a response in the West and those who are opposed to communism, a response that has to be led by the United States, the most powerful country that's come through World War II more unscathed than the others. And the United States that at this time was led by President Truman. Truman, who was the last president not to have a college education, who was not particularly liked by FDR, who was on the ticket more as a symbol than as someone that FDR wanted, not someone who FDR had confided in. He comes into the office really not very well prepared at all, considering that he's the vice president. There are a lot of things that Roosevelt had kept from him that he's kind of learning on the fly. So Truman comes into a very difficult position, this communist advance and takeover of Europe that he feels, and there's widespread feeling in the West about this, that he needs to lead the resistance to this invasion. Over the course of his presidency, Truman develops, I don't know if develops is quite the right word, he displays a real gutsy spirit. He's constantly kind of battling the odds, but he is willing to trust his instincts and to fight for what he believes in. And these really make policies successful. He helps make policies successful that with less determined characters might have been unsuccessful. In his response to Soviet expansion, he is influenced by a member of his staff named George Kennan. George Kennan was a historian, was an expert on Marxism, and wrote a memo for Truman, an extended memo called the Long Telegram, in which he explained Marxist theory adopted and implemented by the Soviets that was based on a concept of history of continued aggression, continued conflict, until the whole world adopted a communist model. And Kennan said there's no peaceful solution in the long term. You can have periods of peace, but these people will always want to agitate violence, either inside your country or against your allies or from the outside of your country, because that's a part of their agenda. That's a part of pursuing a Marxist agenda. And he was extremely accurate in this diagnosis. And Kennan also said the way that the liberal West can resist the spread of communism is by taking advantage of the economic power of the capitalist system. And this was the other highly accurate part of the Long Telegram. He said, eventually, the capitalist system will outproduce the communist system. And then it's much more likely that our model will be successful, that more countries and more people will want to adopt our model than the Soviet model. And this telegram, this memo from Kennan, led Truman to adopt and promote the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine, which was to oppose and contain the spread of communism throughout the world, and the Marshall Plan, which was the financial muscle from the American economy to make this possible. So the Marshall Plan was $12 billion in 1940s money, which is more like $120 billion today. And it was money that was to be used to rebuild Europe and prevent the spread of communism in Europe. And so this money was used to support political parties in France and Italy that would resist or that were alternatives to communist parties that people were starting to consider voting for in large numbers. It was money that was used, first of all, to wage a war against communist rebellions in Greece and Turkey. And it was money that was used to rebuild European infrastructure. Remember, that's the other part of Kennan's telegram. We need to emphasize the strength of our economic model. And in this instance, the Marshall Plan was remarkably successful. The European economies were rebuilt. People saw the prosperity, the economic successfulness of the liberal democratic model and began to lean away from communism. The other flashpoint, or really the first flashpoint in this conflict between East and West, it's called the Cold War, is in Germany. Remember that at the end of World War II, Germany and its capital city of Berlin are divided into 4 occupied zones: British, French, American, and Russian. By 1948, the Western Allies have coalesced their zone of occupation in Germany and their zone of occupation in Berlin. And so now, instead of 4 zones, you have 2, which display, again, the Cold War opposition. East Germany and East Berlin, which are ruled by the communists, and West Germany and West Berlin that are ruled by the Western Allies, with increasing German governance in both. Now, if you look at a map, you'll see that the city of Berlin is a long way inside East Germany. So it was kind of an island in the middle of Eastern Germany. And the wealth and the success of West Germany was a constant source of irritation to Joseph Stalin. And so he planned to surround and blockade West Berlin so that it would fall to the communists. And this was standard communist procedure. Surround a target with troops and kind of dare the Western Allies and the Americans to start a war by attacking someone. And if they didn't, then eventually the region that they'd surrounded would be starved into surrender. And the Allies recognized that this is a crucial battle. If they let Berlin fall, if they let West Berlin fall to the Soviets, then the Soviets will know that they're weak. They'll continue to push them. And so the Americans and the British together carry out what's called the Berlin Airlift. They spend a year flying 200,000 flights into Berlin in all weathers in order to supply West Berlin with the food necessary for it to survive. And in the end, it does. After about a year, Stalin lifts the blockade, and this is a really important moment. It shows that the West is not going to back down. The West, led by the United States, is not going to back down. And it shows Germany, which is in the center of Europe, which is kind of the focal point. Is Germany going to become communist? Is Germany going to remain part of Western Europe? It shows the Germans that they can be reintegrated into Europe. Despite what's happened in the World Wars, they can be adopted back into Europe. Now, in the same year, 1949, the Cold War, the tensions of the Cold War increase again because the Soviets successfully detonate an atomic bomb. Now you have 2 nations with the power to launch and to use these incredibly destructive weapons. And in response, again, Western Europe and the United States form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And basically, this is going to be a treaty of mutual protection. They're afraid of Soviet-Russian aggression, and so they promise to come to the aid of whichever member state is attacked. And of course, the United States is going to do most of the heavy lifting. The United States isn't threatened by a Russian invasion, but it's promising here to come to the aid of its allies who are threatened by Russian invasions. And this moment in 1949, the adoption of NATO, really marks the end of American isolationism. Throughout the really throughout the 20th century, end of the 19th century, but definitely in the 20th century, we've seen the United States becoming established as the wealthiest country in the world and wrestling with these two positions. Is the United States going to be a country that's very involved in the rest of the world, or is it a country that's really mostly going to focus on looking after itself? And this decision to enter NATO, to defend these countries, to promise to defend these countries, even though the United States wasn't under direct threat, marks the end of isolationism, marks the moment at which the party in the United States that believed in taking a more aggressive approach to promoting American values around the world was going to be the one that was most successful. In response, 6 years later in 1955, the Soviet Union establishes a similar organization called the Warsaw Pact. If any one member of the Warsaw Pact was attacked, the others would contribute to its defense.